Live from Toronto, Canada, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio, AM 740.
And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler. Hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come warm yourself by the fire. Oh, it's nice. Feel the flames. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Hey, they've done a nice job here in the Zoomer Radio studio, decorating for the festive season for Christmas and Hanukkah. Can we show our viewers on the YouTube live stream the wonderful decorations here in studio? Are we able to do that, Ryan? Look at that! Isn't that beautiful? And I'll tell you, the down the hall in the FM studio, and across the way there in in master control, where George Janescu, Dr. George, my predecessor, who hosts the show before mine, Big Band Sunday Night, hosts his show. Just festive and beautiful. I've never seen it like this. This is absolutely extraordinary. And if you're not on the YouTube stream, shame on you. If you were, you could see all of this festive splendor, but it's real easy. Just go to the YouTube channel, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett, and hit the sub button. And there you are. You can watch the radio every week. We incidentally, please do hit that sub button. We're trying to get to 7,000 subscribers by the end of 2017. And where are we now, Albert? We're around, Ryan, I think we're around, what?
It's 6,281.
Almost 6,300, on the cusp of 6,300. All right. I think we can get to 7,000 if we all pull up our socks and hit that red sub button, right? All right, let's, please. Just moments away from my conversation with retired firefighter Mark Taylor. What an extraordinary gentleman and an extraordinary story. Back in 2011, in the middle of in the middle of a most debilitating sickness, Mark received what turned out to be prophetic visions regarding the 2016 presidential election. The astonishing true story of the man who saw tomorrow and what he says is coming next. That's just moments away. In hour two, the UFO landing at Sorocco, New Mexico back in 1964. It's been wrapped in controversy almost from the moment that police officer Lonnie Zamoa watched a craft descend and land. Zamoa saw alien beings near the craft and a symbol on its side, but he was told that he shouldn't mention either. It's called Encounter in the Desert. It's a new book by ufologist Kevin Randle. What a veteran, 45 years, a researcher in the ufology arena, if you will, former Vietnam helicopter pilot, and he will reveal what exactly Zamoa saw in that arroyo back in 1964 and what an examination of the landing revealed to investigators. Kevin Randle. Hour two, Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Sorocco. You know, we've never talked about the Sorocco UFO incident on this program, so it is high time we do that. Before we get to all of that, let me, as per usual, introduce the boys in the band. Now, tonight, sitting in on the Flying V Gibson guitar, because young Ian Robertson, my fine rockabilly friend, is out on the left coast in La La Land, Los Angeles, recording an album. How exciting is that? We are just absolutely thrilled for Ian. But we're also thrilled to have this fine young man. He's been with us before, and he's back with us again. Sebastian Hearn, my technical producer, this fine evening. And then here in studio, on the other side of the glass, my good story producer, enigmatic, although he is, idiosyncratic, some might say, on the Rickenbacker bass guitar, occasionally the theremin, Albert Vinzel. And finally, but not lastly, on the Hammond B3, that's an organ, Albert, if you didn't know, that's an organ, the Hammond B3, feature producer and live YouTube stream producer, Ryan White. Wow, let's get to the meat, shall we? The Christmas roast beast, as it were. Back in November of 2016, the world witnessed the impossible. Every update pointed to a loss for the Republican Party, but when the map of the states flipped red in the final hour, there was a select few who weren't surprised. They'd always known Donald J. Trump was going to win. He was chosen for such a time as this. The prophecy had said so. The prophecy had said so. This prophet, this reserved man of God, was retired firefighter Mark Taylor. The word given by the Holy Spirit was delivered on April the 28th, 2011, again in the middle of the most debilitating sickness, when the prophecy later fell into the hands of New York Times bestsellers Dawn and Mary Colbert. God used this new team of passionate individuals to lead the nation into a fervent prayer chain that would accomplish one of the most incredible has ever seen. But Trump's victory was only the beginning. What is coming next for the most powerful nation on earth today? Mark Taylor has more to say. Mark Taylor, welcome to the Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Oh, thank you for having me, brother. I'm doing well. It's an honor to be here.
What a firestorm you created. But take us back, of course, April 28th, 2011, set the stage for us. You were very, very ill. What happened?
Well, I retired. I did 20 years on the job with the City of Orlando Fire Department, and I retired out in 2006 as a lieutenant. And about a month after I retired, I had a visitation from the Lord. And in that visitation, the Lord had shown me that there was going to be some things that I was going to write that would affect my walk and the walks of others. And about 5 months after that, I just started getting sick. I just started going downhill. And I went to doctor after doctor. Nobody could figure out what was wrong with me. I had severe depression, anxiety. I couldn't eat for 4 or 5 days at a time. I couldn't, I was bedridden for 4 or 5 days at a time. I mean, I lost all kinds of weight, but nobody could figure out what was going on. This went on for like 4 or 5 years. And then I finally found the first doctor, a Christian doctor I went to, and he told me that I was suffering from a very low thyroid. I had severe adrenal burnout from the fire service, and I had the hormones of a 70-year-old at 39. So in 2011, I was still sick at the time, and I'm sitting in front of the TV watching Fox News. And I didn't know a whole lot about Donald Trump. I just knew he was a very powerful businessman who had built this empire. And so I knew limited details about him. And so he was toying with the idea of running, but he never announced he was going to run.
No, it was an exploratory at best.
Correct. And so I'm sitting in front of the TV listening to him. And then all of a sudden I heard the Holy Spirit say, "You're hearing the voice of a president." So I got up and I came in here into my bedroom here, which I've made into an office, which I'm at now. I sat down, I put pen to paper like the Apostle Paul did, and I just started writing what the Holy Spirit was telling me. And that was April 28th, 2011. Now, I originally had thought that it was supposed to be for 2012 because there's two other things that go with this. The second thing was I wrote about 2 or 3 months later, I wrote another prophecy called the Great Horse, and that God said that there was another Triple Crown winner coming. And it would be a sign that it would be the time for God's people to break out. And so I wrote that. I put it aside, and then I wrote a third thing that the Lord told me to go back and rewrite General Eisenhower's D-Day speech. And he said, I want you to address it to my army. I said, okay, Lord. So I did that. And I put all these things aside, thinking that it was for 2012. Well, 2012 came and went. Donald Trump never announced he was running. So I thought I had really missed all this stuff. So fast forward to 2015, because at the time I didn't have a platform. I didn't have any friends because I was isolated in my house for like 10 years with this illness that I've been dealing with.
Right.
And so fast forward to 2015, all of a sudden, I kept track of the Triple Crown races and this, that, and the other, especially 2012, because I knew there was one coming. I thought it was 2012. So 2015, June 6th, we get a Triple Crown winner. And I'm on the phone with my sister, and she says, wait a minute, what is today? I said, man, it's D-Day. And I heard the Lord say, release the speech. So I pulled the speech out. I pulled the horse prophecy out. Those two things came to pass in that same day. 10 days later, June 15th, Donald Trump announced that he was running. So I pulled the prophecy out with Donald Trump. And I said, Lord, I thought I had missed all of this stuff. I thought it was for 2012. He said, Mark, all of this stuff was supposed to go down in 2012. But he said, my people were not ready. They needed another 4 years of Obama and this garbage to get a righteous anger to rise up and say, enough is enough. He said, so I held it off. So that's what happened. And if you notice in the Trump prophecy, it says, when Donald Trump announces that he's running, it'll be like the shot heard around the world. Well, that's kind of the sentence that sets the prophecy in motion. He never announced in 2012. So it wasn't until June 15th, 2015, that he announced. That set the prophecy in motion right there.
Interesting. The Eisenhower speech regarding, we all call it D-Day, but it's in fact called, it's Operation Overlord.
Right.
Just a slight departure here. My father was scheduled to partake in the D-Day landings. In a training exercise, he had twisted his ankle, jumping off a moving vehicle as part of the training, and subsequently missed the D-Day landing. Otherwise, we know the slaughter that took place on Juno Beach, etc. I may not be here had he not twisted his ankle. Anyway, That's a real departure. So, the landing at the D-Day speech, why is that significant?
Well, it's significant. There's a whole World War II component to this whole thing that's going on right now, basically because, we had the New World Order rose its ugly head in World War I. We beat them back. It rose again in World War II. We beat them back again. It's rising its ugly head again. We will beat them back again. It's not time for that to take place, this New World Order. And so this is why this whole World War II thing is going on right now, because the Lord had shown me, because you've also got the Fourth Reich that's rising called ISIS that I had prophesied, that the Lord gave me a prophetic word on, that, the same thing that happened in World War II would happen here again, that Russia would come in from the east and the United States and her allies would come in from the west, and they would defeat this Fourth Reich called ISIS. The same thing that happened in World War II. Russia came in from the east, we came in from the west, and we defeated the Nazis. So you're seeing this World War II component take place. And it's also a significance of the D-Day landing as to where the body of Christ is at right now. Excuse me. The Lord was showing me that you've got the body of Christ and the army of God, and they're two totally different things. Think of the body of Christ basically as training camp, boot camp, basically. And the army of God are the mature, spiritually mature. Well, the Lord was telling me, he says, if you go back to D-Day on those ships, you had those guys were on those ships for 3 days. They were seasick. And that's where the majority of the body of Christ is at right now. They're on these ships. They're being tossed about to and fro. All they can focus on is the storm. And they're seasick. They're being tossed about to and fro. Then you've got another group who have been promoted out of the ships and into the landing craft, and they're approaching the beach. Now, anybody that knows any history about D-Day landing, they had obstacles on the beach to keep the armor from landing. Well, you've got this group that are approaching the beach. They see the obstacles. That's all they can focus on are the obstacles right now. So they're not quite where they need to be mature-wise spiritually. Then you've got the third group, which is the army of God. They're the ones that don't focus on the storms. They don't focus on the obstacles. They focus on the mission, and that is to take ground for the kingdom of God and hold it at all costs. So they are hitting the beaches, they are driving inland, and they're taking ground for the kingdom of God and holding it at all costs. So this is where this whole World War II component thing begins to come into play here.
Mark Taylor is my guest. Retired firefighter, received a prophetic vision back in 2011 about the 2016 presidential election. It's all detailed in the Trump Prophecies, the astonishing true story of the man who saw tomorrow and what he says is coming next. Stay with us here on The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett.
Peering into the shadows, where the truth often hides. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. passcodes, social insurance numbers. If they make you wonder how private they are, here's two more numbers: 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Welcome back. Mark Taylor, retired firefighter, prophet, back in 2011 in the midst of a grave illness related to his work as a firefighter. He received a prophetic vision from the Lord, and it was rather interesting. One, he was told to rewrite the General Eisenhower's speech, which was delivered at the D-Day landings. That was June the 6th, 1945 originally. And he was also told that there would be a Triple Crown winner coming. And he was also told, of course, that Donald Trump would be the next president of the United States. Well, it didn't happen in 2012, but it did happen. Well, in 2015, what happened? In 2015, we had, of course, a Triple Crown winner, American Pharaoh. We also had, on that same day, that was the anniversary of the D-Day landings, so June 6, 2015, and the announcement that Trump was running for president. When did that happen, Mark?
It was June 15th of that same year, about 10 days later.
June 15th. Now, what is the significance of the Triple Crown winner in all of this? Rather interesting to throw that into the prophecy.
Yes, because that was a separate prophecy that I had written about 3 months after I wrote the Trump prophecy. And basically, the Triple Crown winner would be a sign for the church or God's people that they would break out. It would be time for them to break out. Now, the Lord told me, I said, because, Lord, I thought this was supposed to happen in 2012. And of course, we talked about that in the last segment. He said, I want you to go back and I want you to research who the horse was in 2012, because if you remember correctly, in 2012, there was one slated to win the Triple Crown winner that year, but it got hurt after the second race and it didn't go for the third race. So I went back and I researched it and researched the name, and the name was I'll Have Another. I thought it sounded strange. I thought it meant I'll have another drink. And the Lord said, no, I'll have another one coming, because my people were not ready yet. So the Lord prolonged all of this. So that's why 2012 came and went, and then the people had to rise up and say enough is enough on November 8th. And then, of course, Donald Trump, we know the outcome of that. So
now, were any of these prophecies that you received, were they published anywhere prior to them actually coming true?
No, I didn't. Again, I was in isolation. I mean, I've been vetted for these things. I handed them out to a couple of friends and some families, and then my doctor. Of course, that's where Dr. Colbert comes in.
Yes.
And Mary Colbert comes in, and then because my first doctor had closed his practice, and then I had to find another doctor, which was, of course, Dr. Colbert. And I went to him one day because I knew he was an evangelical. I didn't have a platform. I just took him some prophetic words, and I had him in a folder when I went in there on one of my physicals that I was going in there with him on, and I handed him the folder. He thought it was signs and symptoms that I was handing him, and he kind of put them on the counter for a minute as we were talking. So as he was checking me out, he started prophesying over me. And he started prophesying that basically, he says, Mark, he says, I feel like the Spirit of God's saying that you're going to wake up one day, you're going to start writing prophetic words. God's just going to download these words to you, and you're going to start writing these words out. I said, well, Doc, I've already started. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, those are the prophetic words right there in the folder I handed you. He says, I thought those were signs and symptoms. I said, no. And that was the Trump prophecy, was one of those prophecies I handed him. So he took the prophecy and he read it. And then he was intrigued by the prophecy, and he took it to his wife, Mary. And because they get tons of stuff. I mean, he treats all the big evangelicals that are out there, a lot of television ministries, stuff like that. And so they get a lot of stuff. So he took it to Mary, and he said, I want you to read this prophecy that God gave Mark. So she read it, and Mary calls it the rhythm of God, basically, because she's been a student of the Bible for over 30 years, and God's word has a rhythm to it. And so when she read it, she heard that rhythm. And so she knew that it was from the Spirit of God, that it didn't come from man, it came from the Spirit of God. So she came out of the office, and had never met Mary before at that time. I mean, this is like, 3 years ago. And she says, Mark, she says, do you realize that, this is a word from God? And I said, well, I think it is. And she says, yes, it is. And she says, do you mind if I share this with some people? And I said, sure, go right ahead. You're free to do whatever you want. And just kind of took off from there.
And so for those thinking, all right, is there corroborating evidence? Is there that these prophecies took place prior to the election of Trump? And they'll want to know, is it in writing anywhere? So when did Don and Mary Colbert publish or at least start talking about your prophecies?
It was way before the elections. It was before anybody even announced they were even running for president. So they had it in their hands way before the election. What the exact date is, that I don't know. But I have been vetted by from pastors from all the way from Jerusalem, actually, called and talked to my previous doctor that I had, that I actually gave him that prophecy in 2011, and another friend of mine as well. So I do have a trail, per se, that people can bet me on, and it's all credible.
Mark Taylor is my guest. It's called The Trump Prophecies, the astonishing true story of the man who saw tomorrow and what he says is coming next. So, election night, what was going through your mind as you saw all of these, the wall of blue states? There was like something like 18 of them, and there were certain ones that had to flip red. It didn't look likely, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, they all flip red. What's going through your mind as you're seeing this happen? Well, beyond all odds.
Yeah, again, it's all odds, man. I mean, you had the news media that was out there. They were saying, "Oh, there's no way Trump's going to win." All the pundits and their polls were out there saying, "There's no way he's going to win." And when election night first started, when the polls began to come in, I mean, it wasn't looking too good in the beginning, and it wasn't until Florida fell and switched red that everything started to fall into place. So it's just amazing how God works. And so, I mean, me and my wife were sitting in bed, and, I just said, look, all I can go by is what God was telling me. That's all I can go by. I just got to have faith that God's going to do what he said he was going to do. And sure enough, I mean, when the announcement came that he had won it, I mean, it was probably the most humbling experience that I can say that I've had, because, I mean, it was just, I was in tears. My wife was in tears. And I mean, because I knew at that point that God was going to turn America around at that point. God's not done with America. That's the problem. Everybody thinks God's done with America. America's under judgment. America's not under judgment. It's the systems that are under judgment, like illegal immigration systems, our banking systems, all the judicial system. All these systems are under judgment right now. That's why you're seeing all this corruption come to the surface, because God himself is exposing it and is going to clean it out.
Mark, a lot of people listening who have a major hate on for the 45th president. Some have called it, almost a mania, an hysteria against the anger against Trump. Right. And even among, his most fervent supporters have not been happy with some of the decisions he's made. But what do you say to those out there who don't see Trump as a great deliverer? They see Trump as almost, the great Satan. What do you say to them?
He's not the deliverer. We only have one deliverer, and that's Jesus Christ, period. But God can use any person he chooses. During the election, I heard a lot where people were saying, "Oh, he's not Christ-like. Why are there evangelicals voting for him? He calls people names." Well, you got to go back and read your Bible, because even the Lord himself called people names. He called them hypocrites. He called them brood of vipers. No man is perfect. There was only one man that walked the earth that was perfect, and that was the Lord himself. So we are imperfect people, but God can choose to use anybody he wants. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. We don't understand God's plan sometimes. We just have to roll with it and just have faith that, believe me, that our Creator knows more than we do. So he chose Donald Trump for such a time as this. He is anointed and appointed by God. And it may be that I don't even agree with some of the stuff that he may do sometimes, or, I don't understand some of the stuff. But it may come to that at some point. At this point, I think he's been doing a great job. But at this point, we need someone in there that has true leadership, because the last 5 presidents, we haven't had true leadership since Reagan. The last 5 presidents we've had in there right now have been told what to do, been told what to say, by a shadow government. That's why they're fighting this man so hard, is because he is true leadership in its purest form. He doesn't take orders from the shadow government. So he's leading by example. So there's a lot to this that people have to understand, that, there's a new world order that it was trying to establish itself, and it's kicking and screaming because we cut the head off that snake November 8th when Donald Trump won. So they're doing everything in their power to try to remove him, which will not work, by the way. He will not be assassinated. He will not be impeached. Not one hair will be harmed on that man's head or his family. He will serve this term, and he will serve a second term, I believe, another 4 years as well.
You know, it's interesting that some have talked about, you know, as you say, Mark, that God chooses whom he will to do his bidding, and they go back to the Old Testament. King David, for example, was
Right.
was not a perfect man. He was an adulterer. In fact, he had his mistress's husband killed.
That's right.
So King David was not a great man. I recently had Rabbi Jonathan Cahn on the program talking about his book, The Paradigm, and he goes back to the Old Testament, comparing Donald Trump to a figure that opposed Jezebel in the northern kingdom of Israel. He was called the warrior.
Ahab.
Well, he was opposing Ahab, but the warrior sounds an awful lot like Donald Trump. He was a political outsider who was rude and crude,
right,
and not someone you would think would be doing God's bidding. But the warrior, this figure, and his name escapes me, Jehu, I think is something like that. Jehu.
Jehu.
Yes, defeated Jezebel, who sounds all the world like Hillary Clinton, ended the dynasty of Ahab and his ancestors. Have you read Kahn's book, The Paradigm? What do you think of that analogy that Trump is the warrior from the Old Testament?
I have not read Rabbi's book. I do have it, but I just haven't had a chance to read it. It's astonishing. I mean, again, there's no coincidences with God. I mean, God is. I mean, just take the horse race thing, for instance. You know what I mean? It happened on D-Day. It matched up with the D-Day speech. It was a sign that, hey, this is all coming to pass right now. So, I mean, God works in mysterious ways. Again, we don't know his ways. We don't know his thoughts. Our thoughts are not his thoughts, or our ways not his ways. So, I mean, it's very, to me, it's exciting to see God work in this capacity. Whether it's this, whether it's the paradigm, whatever the case may be, God works in mysterious ways, and it's exciting to sit back and see what God is doing right now. He is the one who's going to deliver America, not Donald Trump, not man, but he uses man to do his work a lot of times. So it's up to us to engage the enemy from a spiritual standpoint and take that ground back and hold it for the kingdom of God. It would hold it at all costs. This is a part where we're taking back our country. This is not a fight just for America. This is a fight for the entire earth right now. And this is where the army of God's going to rise up and shine in this hour right now. You're going to see souls come into the kingdom of God like we've never seen in the history of mankind. It's about to break forth right now.
Trump has certainly courted evangelicals. He's courted, Catholics. Again, going back to Rabbi Kahn's book, The Warrior, courted, religious groups in the northern kingdom of Israel at a time when they were, certainly worshiping Baal and were moving away from a monotheistic religion. Is Trump, in your estimation, moving towards becoming an ardent believer himself? I mean, certainly he says the right things a lot of the times. He doesn't always act like a Christian, but what is your sense? Is Trump on the verge? He's been described as a baby Christian by some evangelicals, like a newbie. But what is your sense of Trump in terms of his spiritual journey?
Well, my co-author, Mary Colbert, she sits on his spiritual advisory board, him and her and Dr. Don. So I know for a fact that he is, in fact, a Christian because, they talk about it all the time. He actually, let me put it to the listeners this way. He actually told his spiritual advisory board that he wants to be known as the most praying president in history. That's what he wants to leave as his legacy. Now, how many presidents in the past have ever really said that and really acted on it? I don't know if anybody else has really had so much as a so-called spiritual advisory board. I mean, it may have been for smoke and mirrors type thing, but this is the real deal because I know some of the people that sit on that spiritual advisory board. So, I mean, he's got people, he's surrounding himself with Christians. He's doing things to, like the abortion issues, the attacks against the Christians. He's standing up for the Christians. He's bringing back Merry Christmas. All these things he's doing right now, the evangelicals need to take notice that God is, in fact, using this man. His hand is upon him. Wouldn't
you like, though, to see more repentance on the part of the president in terms of, let's face it. He can be a bit of a bully, and he is a disruptor, certainly. And again, we go back to God uses men in mysterious ways and so forth.
That's right.
But I don't know. For me, I'd like to see Trump be a little more repentant. Maybe in his, I don't know, in his tweets, say, I'm sorry if I've hurt people or what have you. Let me leave that as sort of a, let's leave that question hanging. When we come back, I'll get you to address that. Mark Taylor, author of The Trump Prophecies, The Astonishing True Story of the Man Who Saw Tomorrow and What He Says is Coming Next. And we will discuss what's coming next on The Conspiracy Show.
Fasten your seatbelt and put your tray in the upright position. You're about to leave everything you know behind on The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. Providing the evidence and letting you draw your own conclusions. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Welcome back. Just a reminder, coming up after the top of the hour, Kevin Randle, longtime ufologist, 45 years in this arena, and his new book, Encounter in the Desert, The Case for Alien Contact at Sorocco. That was back in New Mexico, 1964. The landing of what appeared to be an alien spacecraft and alien beings, according to the eyewitness testimony of a police officer, and that was Alani Zamora. Anyway, we'll discuss that with Kevin Randle again at the top of the hour. Right now, Mark Taylor stays with us, retired firefighter, back in 2011, had a prophetic vision from the Lord, he says. It's all documented in his book with co-author Mary Colbert, The Trump Prophecies, The Astonishing True Story of the Man Who Saw Tomorrow and What He Says is Coming Next. So before we get on to, other prophecies and what is coming next, let me just ask you about, if Trump is a Christian, and I hope he is, I am not a very good one, but I'm hoping Trump is. And but a lot of people look at his behavior, they look at his tweets and so forth. If he is in fact a Christian, should that be reflected in the way he's treating other people at this point? And people, that's a main stumbling block for a lot of people, even other Christians, that he's just not acting like a Christian.
Well, let's go back for a minute. I mean, if you go back through history and look at the prophets of old, some of these guys were very direct. They were like a bull in a china shop. And so, I mean, Donald Trump to me is kind of like a political prophet, if you will. And, you were talking about repentance earlier. You'd like to see a little bit more of a repentant heart.
Yes.
You got to look at what this guy's dealing with. He is dealing with some of the most evil people on the face of this earth, period. Hillary Clinton, Obama, all this mess that he's walked into. God chose the right man, because it's going to take a bull in a china shop to go in and clean this stuff up. And that's what you're seeing taking place. Now, I know people are used to seeing these Christians that are like, ho-hum, and they're nice and this, that, and the other.
Turn the other cheek.
Turn the other cheek, you know what I mean? This, that, and the other. And it's like, look, you got to understand what he is dealing with right now. And it's going to take a very heavy hand. I was with the fire service for 20 years. I'm third generation firefighter, and I was an officer. And, when I would walk into a fire station, I'd be assigned to a new station or whatever the case may be. If depending on what the issues were, depending on how heavy handed you'd have to be in order to straighten this stuff out. And it's going to take a very heavy hand, which is what Donald Trump has right now, to straighten this country out right now. So that's what you're seeing taking place. It's not the candy-coated Christian, so to speak, or like you said, turn the other cheek. It's going to take a heavy hand. It's going to take a bull in a china shop, and that's what he is.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you say. I've often referred to Trump as the third law of Newtonian physics. He is the opposite reaction. That's opposite and equal reaction to everything that sort of happened beforehand. So the pendulum has swung so far one way, and now it's swinging back the other way. And that swinging back is often tumultuous and somewhat violent at times.
Yeah, and here's the other thing, too, people have to understand. We've been indoctrinated as people the last 5 presidents. And that's, 32 years worth, where they've been told what to say. They've been told to be politically correct. This man's not politically correct. I'm not politically correct. I tell the truth, but I tell it in love, but I'm going to tell you the truth, whether you want to hear it or not, whether they like it or not. And that's the same way Donald Trump is. So I respect someone like that. I would rather have someone tell me the truth versus lie to me and have it harm me later on. So I think what's happening is it's like a culture shock almost, where they've had 32 years of the past 5 presidents being politically correct. And now here comes Donald Trump, who's not politically correct, and they're just not used to it. So I think there's a lot of that going on right now, where they're just not used to someone coming out and saying, hey, this is the way it is. This is the truth right here.
Mark, after 2011, what other prophetic visions or messages from God did you receive?
Well, I wrote one called Don't Be Deceived, Get in the Fight, October 13th, 2015. And it talked about the Clintons, that they were both going to go down for the crimes that they committed, including Obama. Then I wrote another one, November 17th of 2015, called Time Is Up for Those Who Are Corrupt. And that God was going to basically take down all of these corruption that's going on in the United States, which we're seeing taking place right now. Another one that I wrote was Do Not Fear America. Now, I wrote this February 24th, 2016. The Lord originally started dealing with me about the Supreme Court. And I know this is a hot button for a lot of people right here, the Supreme Court. He originally told me, I originally heard the Lord telling me it was going to be 3 Supreme Court justices that he was going to replace. And then the Lord came back and he said, no, it's going to be 5.
5?
I said, okay, Lord.
Wow.
And so when Scalia, because the Lord told me about a month or 2 before it happened, he said, one's going to die, one's going to retire, and 3 will be caught in a scandal and have to be removed. And so when Scalia, about a month or 2 later, Scalia died. And I told Mary this ahead of time. And
your co-author, Mary Colbert.
Yeah, my co-author. And so I had written this prophecy because everybody was panicking when Scalia died, because they knew the Democrats, they knew Obama were wanting to replace a Supreme Court justice before he got out in case something happened. So everybody was in fear. So God gave 2 signs at Scalia's funeral that confirmed that they were not going to get the appointment. So I wrote that prophetic word, "Do not fear America," February 24th, 2016. And basically what God was saying was, no, Obama will not appoint another Supreme Court justice. It was being reserved for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump will appoint 5. Now, when God reforms the court with 5 Supreme Court justices, that case called Roe versus Wade would be overturned.
Wow. That would be monumental.
Yes.
Now, that is all somewhat contingent on, obviously, even without the nuclear option, or with the nuclear option, rather, that is, the Senate only needs a simple majority to confirm Supreme Court nominations. That means, with the midterms coming up, they're going to have to retain, the Republicans they're going to have to retain that majority. No president, well, even Reagan, after his election, he lost, I think, the House, he lost the Senate, Obama the same. It's what are you hearing about the midterms then? If he's going to nominate 5 Supreme Court justices, that means 4 more, rather, and get them approved by the Senate, he's going to have to hold on to that Senate majority. That's, at this point, not looking likely.
Well, that's what they said about the election too. But the thing is that he's going to serve a second term, so it may not be this first term that he gets all 5.
Right. Good point.
It could be the second term. So again, you have to be careful with the prophetic, because we think it means one thing when in fact all of a sudden when it comes to pass you go, oh, that's what it meant. See, it's like the part in the Trump prophecy talked about Obama serving a 3rd term, and everybody was gigging me on it. And it's like, look, I'm just telling you what the Lord said. And they said, well, you can't do that because of the Constitution. Well, now we're seeing his 3rd term play out because he's got a shadow government. He's trying to dethrone Donald Trump, and he's operating, 2 miles from the White House?
There you go. On the taxpayer's dime as well.
We don't always think, we don't always know what exactly it is. So,
Mark, I gotta jump in here. Hold on, we'll come back. I want to talk to you about something else, and that is the possibility that the U.S. Embassy will be moved to Jerusalem. Some might call that prophetic, monumental. We'll come back. Mark Taylor, the Trump Prophecies, right here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't you dare go away.
The owners of the system are asleep. Now we can play. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. a look around. What do you really see? This is where you can tell all about it. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Mark Taylor, my guest, until the top of the hour. The Trump Prophecies, the astonishing true story of the man who saw tomorrow and what he says is coming next. Wanted to ask you about, well, this is actually was passed many years ago, I think under George W. Bush, and that is to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv, where most of the world's embassies are in Israel, to Jerusalem. But the presidents have kept delaying and delaying and delaying it, kicking the can down the road. Now comes word that I believe from Vice President Mike Pence that Trump may be the one to actually sign that into law, that or to sign that executive order that the U.S. Embassy in Israel will be moved to Jerusalem. I mean, that could cause tremendous upheaval in the Middle East, some say. What can you tell me about that, Mark? Have you received any prophetic words about that, or what are your personal thoughts?
I haven't received any. God hasn't really showed me anything on that. I do know that he was talking about moving the embassy to Jerusalem for a while there, and I think the prime minister actually had him hold off on it because they were worried about it causing problems. I do know I think he's fixing to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, if I'm not mistaken, if I read that correctly on the headlines. So, I mean, that's really about all I know as far as that is concerned.
All right. What else is in store in the next several years with Trump in the White House? What else can you tell? What other prophetic visions have you received?
Well, I wrote a prophetic word called Energy, and that was December 16th, 2016. And basically what the Lord was saying was that America and Israel will be the number one energy producers in the world, and they will be energy independent. They will no longer need OPEC. They won't need the Middle East anymore. And the thing about this is that when I wrote this word, at the time I wrote it, which was, again, December 16th, 2016, in the prophecy, it talks about these OPEC countries, how they've used their oil money to attack other countries from within. In other words, they were using their money for terrorism. And the Lord in this prophetic word said that their wells will go dry and their finances too, and they will actually have to be fed by the red, white, and blue. In other words, they will have to come to America and Israel for their energy. And now we couldn't figure out, when Donald Trump went on his first trip to Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
He went there and he made a massive arms deal with Saudi Arabia, or Saudi Arabia made a deal with us. And nobody could figure out why. And brother, let me tell you, I was watching, somebody had sent me the video from Fox News. I didn't even know this. My mouth dropped when I heard this. It was Brett Baer. And they were doing a report on why they were doing the arms deal. It was because Saudi Arabia knows their wells are about to go dry. And so their finances would dry up. So they wouldn't have the money to make this purchase. So they're doing it now while they have the money. So that was incredible to me. Again, another humbling experience when some of these prophetic words begin to come to pass like that these countries, their wells are about to go dry, basically. And Israel and America will be the number one energy producers in the world. Interesting.
And Israel, a major energy producer, so that would tend to suggest major oil discoveries coming in Israel?
Yes, absolutely.
Fascinating. Well, we are seeing a major realignment in the Middle East. Who would have thought, that at least unofficially that Saudi Arabia would be forming an alliance with Israel, and that's happening.
Yes. Absolutely.
What about North Korea? Mark, obviously all eyes on North Korea and their nuclear capabilities. Have you received any prophetic visions about that? Because that could be the nexus.
Show me anything too much on North Korea. I just know the United States is going to be protected. God's going to protect the United States and Israel.
Interesting. How do you receive these visions? I mean, when you were ill back in 2011, how did it come to you, and how does it come to you now?
I've probably got, you can go to my website. People can, it's swordrescue.com. It's sword spelled SORD rescue.com, and they can pull up all my prophetic words for free. They can download them, read them. I've probably got maybe, close to 15 words on there at this point. And, most of these words, I've only sat down and penned out 2 or 3 of these words at one sitting, and Trump prophecy was one of them. But the rest of them, they take me sometimes a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes it takes me a couple of months to pen some of these prophecies out. And I'll just meditate on stuff, and the Lord starts downloading stuff to me, and I'll just start taking notes almost. And this will go on for 2 or 3 weeks. And, in the Bible, it talks about the prophet Jeremiah, where he said that it burned in his bones, and he had to get the word out because it was like a fire in his bones, so to speak.
Right.
For me, it's not that. For me, it's like a pressure that builds up. And so I'll start taking notes for like a couple of weeks or so, and these bullet points that God will give me. And this pressure begins to build. And when I can't take it anymore, I know it's time to sit down and start writing it out. And I'll start writing it out what the Lord's telling me. And then I'll move sentences around where it begins to flow. And then when I type it out, the Lord will change things. He'll say, no, move this one here or that there. That's just everybody hears differently. You know what I mean? And I'm just one of those type of guys. I take notes. This pressure begins to build, and the Lord just starts filling in the blanks, basically. The more I meditate on what he wants me to meditate on, the more he gives me.
I'm sure you've been asked this 1,000 times, but or more. A retired firefighter from Orlando, Florida. You must ask yourself repeatedly, why me, Lord? Well, why you, Mark? Why you of all the 7 billion souls on this planet? Why Mark Taylor?
Yeah, brother. If I knew the answer to that question, I have asked the Lord. It's like, Lord, I'm nobody. I mean, I am literally. I have never been to Bible college. I've never been to theology school or whatever you want to call it, seminary school. I don't have a degree of any kind hanging on my wall. I am simply a everyday, normal, common person that has yielded himself over to the Lord Jesus Christ to use in whatever capacity he wants to use me in. And it all I got saved back when I was 8 years old. But I mean, when I had that experience, when the Lord visited me right after I retired, a month after I retired, that visitation I had, that rocked me, man, like nothing I've ever been through. And I mean, it changed, put me on a trajectory course of destiny, basically. And why did God choose me? I don't have a clue, because again, like you said, there are 7 billion other people out there who are just everyday, normal, common people. He could have chosen any one of them.
If I remember seeing on YouTube, there was a pastor from Australia who was also talking about prophecies or messages he had received from the Lord. He was also talking about Trump being president. I can't remember his name. Do you remember? Do you recall?
No, I know who you're talking about. I don't know the gentleman's name, though.
Yeah, he's since passed away, but and his videos were on YouTube. He was talking about Trump. So, I mean, there is sort of corroborating, I don't know, prophetic wisdom or whatever you want to call it out there.
Sure.
What other changes, what other world-altering changes do you see in the U.S. government coming on the horizon, Mark?
Well, I think the midterms, I think you're going to see the biggest shakeup in the midterms, probably in U.S. history, for several reasons. One of the things that the Lord showed me right before Donald Trump, right before the election, God started dealing with me a couple of weeks. And then I released it on an interview I did the day after the election, was that you're going to see military-style tribunals break out, because it's going to take that, because the length, the width, the depth of this corruption is so great. It's going to take these military-style tribunals for these treasonous acts that they've committed in order to handle all of this. So that's one of the things that you're going to see happen. But God's going to root out all of this corruption. This is not going to stop. I tell people, you need to just put your seatbelt on, get ready. This is going to be a long ride, because this stuff's going to be going on for years, basically, because God's not going to stop exposing it. He's going to clean house. And you got to remember, this is like remodeling a house. When you remodel a house, there's a demolition phase, and it can get nasty, it can get dirty, it can even get dangerous sometimes. And that's the kind of the phase we're in right now. But that's what it's going to take in order to rebuild it.
Yeah, some have suggested, once God moves in the early going, he's simply moving furniture around. But as you say, it's going to get pretty wild.
Yeah. But rest assured, he is in charge. He's still on the throne, and America will prosper like never before. Not saying we're not going to have some issues along the way, because we will, but America will prosper like never before, because America is going to be used as the hub, just like D-Day. Like Britain was the hub for the D-Day launch, America will be the hub for which the end time harvest of souls will be launched.
I know I've mentioned Rabbi Jonathan Cahn a number of times, but he's such a tremendous, mind and spirit, and he's been on the program a number of times, and he has often drawn the comparison between the United States and ancient Israel, particularly, the northern kingdom of Israel under God's judgment when they turned away from God, drawing the comparison with the United States. Is this merely sort of a window of opportunity to turn things around, or sort of a respite from God's judgment, or is Trump in fact going to reverse all of this and God's judgment against the United States?
Well, it's not so much Trump reversing it as it is the people. And what people have to understand is that, Second Chronicles 7:14 says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and repent, basically. It's my people. That's not the person on the street that's not a Christian. He's talking about God's people. And what we had happen on November 8th was because the army of God, those spiritually mature, because you got to understand something. The reason America's in the mess that it's in is because the church has not done its job. And it's the army of God, the spiritually mature, those who don't even go to church, the remnant, basically, rose up and repented on behalf of the country and the land, the people in the land. God heard the prayers and answered the prayers. And that's why, if God was going to truly judge America, he would have allowed Hillary Clinton as the president. That's why I've been saying that God has shown me all along, it's the systems that are under judgment. It's the leadership that's under judgment. It's the church that's under judgment. So that's why America will prosper like never before. It's going to be used as the end time harvest hub, basically.
Mark, thank you so much for this. Where can people order the book?
They can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, either one.
And your website again, quickly?
Swordrescue.com.
Swordrescue.com. The Trump Prophecies. Mark, thank you so much. A delight meeting you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Mark Taylor. When we come back, Encounter in the Desert, Kevin Randle, the case for alien contact at Socorro, New Mexico. Stay with us.
Owned and operated by MZ Media Incorporated. Zoomer Radio. Timeless hits. Live from Toronto, Canada, Earth, The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio.
Thanks for inviting me into your home, your long-haul truck, RV camper taxi, your parents' basement, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate in your cabin in the woods. Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Hello to all of you listening in on our flagship station, the all-powerful Zoomer Radio, 50,000 watts, a clear channel of truth, peace, and love, blasting across the continent from the Great White North. Thank you to all of you listening in on one of our affiliate stations across North America. The podcast, of course, check it out at talkzone.com. Those of you who take the show wherever you go on, well, there are two terrific radio apps, the Zoomer radio app and the Conspiracy Show radio app, both free downloads, by the way. The live YouTube stream, check it out at The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett. Don't forget to hit the subscription button. However, and wherever you're listening, I bid thee the warmest of welcomes, and I thank you for your fine company. Just a quick note that I think you'll be interested in knowing, and that is I've been talking the last several weeks about a new podcast that I am about to launch. It does launch on Monday, December the 4th, 3 episodes every week. Now, it's called Conspiracy Unlimited. Now, here's the thing. If you go looking for it right now, it's up on iTunes, but it hasn't been approved by iTunes yet. So I would say by tomorrow night, you should be able to find it. And by that point, I will have linked up my website, conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com, will point you to that podcast. All right, so be patient. I would say by late tomorrow night, you'll be able to log on to conspiracypodcast.com, find the podcasts. There'll be 3 of them waiting for you. There'll be actually 4. There'll be a little welcome podcast, a little 2 minutes welcoming you to Conspiracy Unlimited, and then 3 brand new episodes, and look for 3 brand new episodes every week that will be uploaded every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And what I urge you to do is subscribe now for free. At some point in the future, we may charge a small subscription fee, but I'm really hoping you'll get on board now and support Conspiracy Unlimited, my brand new podcast. Of course, the podcast for the Conspiracy Show still available. Nothing's changing. Still doing the weekly radio show, which will also be available as a podcast. So it's just, you know what? Here's the thing. There's too much going on in the world to be able to cover it all doing 2 hours a week. And I am so grateful to have this opportunity at Zoomer Radio. But I need more time. So that's what the podcast is all about. Hope you'll check it out. conspiracyunlimitedpodcast.com. Not quite ready yet. Give it 24 hours and we'll be up and running. All right. Young Sebastian is here, sitting in for Ian, my technical producer, who is in Los Angeles recording an album. Very excited about that for Ian. I hope he'll come back and remember us. Of course, in studio, my story producer, Albert Vinzel, and our live YouTube stream producer and feature producer, Ryan White, also with us. The UFO landing at Sorocco has been wrapped in controversy almost from the moment that police officer Lonnie Zamora watched a craft descend and land. Zamora saw alien beings near the craft and a symbol on its side, but he was told that he shouldn't mention either. It's all documented in Encounter in the Desert, which reveals for the first time exactly what Zamora saw in that arroyo back in 1964 and what an examination of the landing revealed to investigators. Now, Sorocco wasn't a standalone case. Other sightings, some of them nearly as spectacular as Zamora's, were reported at the time. A study of the Air Force investigation of this case reveals an effort at first to learn the truth that mutated into a clever attempt to hide the information from the public. Encounter in the Desert reveals all this and much more. Kevin Randle is a retired Army lieutenant colonel who served as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam and an intelligence officer in Iraq. He studied anthropology and journalism at the University of Iowa and holds advanced degrees from the American Military University and California Coast University. He's been studying UFOs for 50 years. He's published dozens of books about the subject, including Crash, When UFOs Fall from the Sky. He hosts a radio show on the X Zone Broadcast Network and a blog, A Different Perspective. He's appeared on dozens of television and radio shows, including The Today Show and Good Morning America. Wow, what a pleasure to welcome Kevin Randle to The Conspiracy Show. Kevin, how are you?
I'm fine, but I'm not sure I want to be linked to the Today Show.
That's true. That's true. Well, yeah, there's a lot of things going on in the MSM, and that's all right. We're not going to hold that against you. You know what? You were able to sort of break through that glass ceiling and get the word out on the MSM. So however you chose to use the Today Show, good for you. But we're delighted to have you here, Kevin.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Now, interesting. I mean, when did you? I mean, you were aware of the UFO incident at Socorro, New Mexico, for a long time, obviously. But when did it all start to impact you? I mean, when you started to sort of put the pieces together.
Well, part of it was investigating the Roswell case, and we were over on the plains of San Augustine. When I say we, Don Schmidt and I, and of course we were in Socorro, so we asked a few questions around there. So there's always kind of an interest there. But on my radio program, I had on Ben Moss and Tony Angiola. Wow, I suddenly have a frog in my throat. I don't believe this. Anyway, excuse me. Anyway, they had said a couple of things on the program that sparked my attention. I never got good answers for. One of them was they said that there were 3 witnesses who'd called into the police prior to Zamora seeing the thing land out on the outskirts of town. And I said, did you see the police log? And they never answered the question. And I'm not sure why we never got an answer to the question. But that got my interest, and they said a couple of other things like that I found kind of provocative. So I looked at, I got back and looked at the Air Force file, the whole Air Force file. And in it, going through it, I found a report from a fellow named Captain Richard Holder. He was an Army officer who had, well, I don't know what's going on here.
Do you want to get some water? Do you have some water nearby?
Yeah, I got that. Wow. This has never happened to me before. I'm so embarrassed. I'm turning bright red.
No.
No. Anyway, Captain Richard Holder was the uprange commander at the White Sands missile range, White Sands Proving Grounds. And his duty station, White Sands is really based down near Alamogordo, quite a ways from Socorro, but his duty station was much closer to Socorro. So he lived in Socorro. And within an hour and 20 minutes of the landing, he was called in either by the FBI or his executive officer alerted him, but he went into the Socorro police station, so he's talking to Lonnie Zamora.
Right.
The whole point of this is that he wrote a short report that very night within hours of the landing, and in this report, it said that 3 people had called into the police station and reported either a blue flame in the sky or an object in the sky. That verifies what Ben Moss and Tony Angiola had said. It wasn't in the police logs, but it was in this official report that Holder had written. No names are attached to it because the police dispatcher didn't bother to write down their names. I'm thinking, if I was investigating this case in 1964, one of the things I would have said, because we knew the path that the thing flew in and flew out of, I would have gone to the area where the thing overflew and knocked on doors until I found some people who had witnessed the thing. We could get some names attached to that and some better description.
Sure.
That never happened. I don't understand why.
Unbelievable.
Carl and Jim Lorenzen, who were the leaders of the Aerophenomena Research Organization out of Tucson, Arizona, who actually had one time lived in Alamogordo, were there within 48 hours. This would be something that I would have thought they would have done, but they didn't. Hynek was there, J. Allen Hynek, who was the Air Force consultant of Blue Book. He was there within days. He didn't bother with it. The official Air Force investigator, Sergeant David Moody, he didn't bother. Ray Stanford was there from NICAP. He didn't bother. I mean, all these people were there investigating this thing, and nobody bothered to find these other witnesses, which I think would be very important. We have Zamora's story, and it was taken down, again, literally within hours of the sighting by Holder and the FBI agent, a guy named Arthur Burns. So we have good records of that. And then we have the other investigations that were done. There was a report in the April Bulletin by the Lorenzens. They were there within 48 hours, so we've got a good record there. We've got Hynek's report. We've got a report from a guy named Connor, who was allegedly, I say allegedly, the public affairs officer at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, he had driven actually Hynek down to Socorro. He's got a report in there. He had an additional duty as the base UFO officer, which I thought was kind of strange, but so we've got his report. So there's all kinds of documentation leading up to this. So we got very good documentation of what happened within literally hours of the thing landing.
Right. When you talk to Ben Moss and Tony Angiola, they also interviewed, I believe at the time it was the only living person who had investigated the case, and that was a gentleman by the name of Ray Stanford.
Stanford, yes, Stanford, yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, tell me about Ray Stanford.
Well, I interviewed him as well, but he was a member of the NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, the Washington D.C. group under Donald Kehoe. But he was out there. He talked to Zamora. He talked to Sam Chavez, who was Zamora's pal. And when Zamora, after the thing had taken off, Zamora called the police station and asked for for Chavez to come out. Chavez was a state policeman. And so he interviewed all those people. He talked to the radio, a reporter who interviewed them as well. He talked to, he was there with the radio reporter in a restaurant, going to have dinner, and these two older women came up and said they had seen the object or heard the object. Audio witnesses is what Stanford calls them. But he didn't get the names, and he didn't follow up on it. And when I talked to him, I said, well, do you have the names in your file? He said, well, they'd be dead by now. They were middle-aged at the time. And I'm thinking, but it would tell me where they lived in Socorro.
Right.
And I might be able to find somebody in Socorro.
They would have family. They would have neighbors and friends that they would have talked to.
Precisely.
Kevin, hold on. We're going to take a time out. Kevin Randle, author of Crash, Where UFOs Fall from the Sky. His new one is Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Socorro. This is a magnificent, well-documented case from New Mexico. Police officer Lonnie Zamora watched a craft descend and land. He saw alien beings near the craft and a symbol on its side. We'll discuss further on the other side with Kevin Randle. Stay with us on The Conspiracy Show.
In a democracy, we elect officials so we can sleep at night. So why are you up? 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Team and get it straight.
No, but
Doctors and family.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Welcome back. Kevin Randle is with us. Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Socorro. You know, Kevin, we always talk about Roswell and to a lesser extent maybe the Aztec UFO incident, but as you point out, Socorro is one of the best examples in Project Blue Book, but still it flies under the radar, no pun intended. Why is that, do you suppose?
Because things like Roswell have the possibility of providing all the evidence you'd need to prove alien visitation. With Socorro, you have an observation by a police officer. You have some landing traces, which are interesting in and of themselves. You have official investigation. You have a lot of things going on with Socorro. But when you get down to it, you have Lonnie Zamora as the main observer. You have indications of other witnesses who are lost to, I guess, the fog of time. So it doesn't have the same robust nature of something like Roswell, although Roswell has kind of lost its robustness in recent years. I did a book just last year called Roswell in the 21st Century, looking at it, attempted to look at it in a dispassionate way to see where we stood on it, found that a lot of what we believed about Roswell turned out not to be true, and a lot of the people who'd come forward or had been found to talk about the case really were basically making up their stories, and that hurt the whole entire case. With Socorro, you don't have a lot of places to go to talk to people. You don't have a lot of witnesses. You can look at the pictures of the landing traces. You can look at the analysis of the soil samples and the vegetation that were taken and that sort of thing. But when you get down to it, you don't have the same robust nature. To kind of understand Socorro, you have to begin looking at what was going on around Socorro at the time, which is one of the things I did. Other cases that affect the Socorro case. There was one in La Madera in northern New Mexico, took place within, I think, 24 hours of the Socorro landing, and you have the same sort of thing. The craft on the ground, it lifts off in a flame and it leaves burns on the ground, which is suggestive of what happened at Socorro. Hynek, who was in Socorro, knew about the case and he asked permission to go investigate it, and the Air Force said no. I'm thinking, I'm a consultant here, I'm a civilian, I'm going to talk to these people about it, but he didn't do that. The official Air Force investigator didn't do it. But that whole case came about, it was reported by the witness prior to the information getting out about the Socorro case, so he didn't know about Socorro when he reported. So I find that interesting. There were some other sightings that took place south of Socorro, basically on the White Sands Missile Range, looking off toward the west over the mountains there, that are suggestive of the object that Zamora had seen. So you put all of that together and it becomes a little bit more of a robust sighting. But nobody had really done that to this point. Everybody kind of talked about Socorro and then they would go off and leave it. They didn't talk about what was going on around it at the time. And I thought that was important to look at as well.
Certainly. Well, for those not familiar intimately with the Socorro case, tell us about Lonnie Zamora and what he saw on that night in 1964.
You mean there were people that don't know this story?
Hard to believe, but yes.
According to everything in the files, Zamora was chasing a speeder in Socorro, and he heard a roar off in the distance, and he thought a dynamite check that was on the edge of town had blown up. So he broke off the pursuit of the speeder, and he went over in that direction and came up over a hill. And looking down in the arroyo, he saw what he thought was an overturned car, for crying out loud, overturned car. And he drove down close to it, got out of the police car and walked even down closer to it, got fairly close to it, and noticed two, and he used various terms. I think he said people once, according to one of the transcripts in the Blue Book files, but he mostly called them things. Talked about them being the size of children or small adults. And that when one of them looked at him and saw him there, seemed startled, and they both disappeared around behind the landed craft. The craft had sat down, landed. By the time he got there, there was a sound like a vault door closing, and then there was a roar, and the thing lifted off, drifted horizontally for a while, and then shot up into the sky. He called Sam Chavez right away, and Chavez was there in a couple of minutes. And I make that distinction because it's important, because one of the suggestions that it was some kind of a hot air balloon that we were experimenting with, although there's no evidence of that. And the point is, it wouldn't have disappeared in the sky before Chavez got there. He would have seen it too, but he didn't. He went back to the police station, and within an hour, probably less, Burns and Holder, the Air Force, the Army officer, and the FBI guy were there, basically interrogating him and talking to him about it, to what he'd seen. Talked about the symbol he'd seen on it. Holder suggested to him, not in a way to suppress the information, but suggested that maybe they'd not release what the thing looked like precisely, because that way, if other people had seen it and described the symbol, they would be able to eliminate the copycats. Burns suggested to him that maybe he wouldn't want to talk about the alien creatures. I say alien, that's my word.
Right.
Zamora never talked about them being alien creatures or extraterrestrials, but the beings that he saw down there. Burns suggested maybe he didn't want to talk about that because it would open him up to ridicule by other people in the press. And that's kind of what he did. So eventually it came about that he really didn't see anything but white coveralls down below by the craft. Although it's clear from the descriptions in the Project Blue Book files and what he said that there was more than just coveralls, but he didn't see a lot of detail about the beings. The thing was on the ground for a couple of minutes at the most. And once it lifted off, he went down to see it. Chavez showed up. He went down. They found an area, a bush that was kind of still smoking. And Chavez said that when he touched the bush, it wasn't hot. It was smoking, but it wasn't hot. And only half of it had been burned, which they found weird. And some of the vegetation around the landing site had been burned. And there were 4 distinct impressions on the ground, which were, according to the analysis made by the Air Force and the various investigators, were pressed into the earth as opposed to excavated. So something heavy had sat down there and pressed itself into the earth. And that becomes important. Philip Klass said that, there was an asymmetrical landing gear, and he put knitting needles through a Brillo pad on a map of the landing gear things and showed how asymmetrical it was. But when you correct it for the terrain and make a couple of other measurements, what you find out is the flame was in the center of it, and the landing gear were symmetrical, but it was the terrain that made it look like they were asymmetrical. So, what you would expect, although I'm not sure that we can say that an alien race, if they're landing a craft in New Mexico, would necessarily be as anal about the symmetry of the landing gear as we might be. You would expect them to be, because it makes it more stable, but we don't know what the aesthetics of the alien race would be.
What do we know about Lonnie Zamora?
Lonnie Zamora was a steady police officer who apparently handed out speeding tickets to the students, both high school and the ones at the mining institute there. So they didn't care for him, but he was fuzz in the 1960s. He had been, I think, a soldier in, I don't know whether he was a soldier or Marine. I think he was a soldier in Korea, and he stayed with the New Mexico National Guard up to his retirement. He stayed on as a police officer some 15 years after this event, and then eventually took another city job until he retired. Hynek paid him kind of a left-handed compliment in one of the reports said that, well, he didn't think that Lonnie Zamora was involved in a hoax because he wasn't astute enough to have perpetrated a hoax on his own.
That is a backhanded compliment.
Yeah. Which attests to his honesty. I couldn't find anything that would suggest that he wasn't trustworthy, that he wasn't a good policeman. The most recent nonsense to come out is, well, he drank beer and people saw him drinking beer in the tavern. I'm thinking, oh my God, he drank beer. Nothing in any of the reports to suggest he had been drinking before duty on April 24th when the thing landed, during duty or afterwards. And we've got two investigators, Holden and Burns. And Burns is an FBI guy, so this is kind of his meat and potatoes.
They were on the scene awfully quick, don't you think?
Well, he lived in Socorro.
Oh, he did. Okay, that explains that. All right.
Yeah, as did Holder. So they lived in Socorro. They got there very, very quickly, as you say. But there's nothing in any of the reports to suggest any alcohol involved at all. And yet, we're supposed to. And even if he became the town drunk in the years after this thing, it would be relevant to the sighting of April of 1964 because there's no evidence that he was that prior to that, and no evidence that he was the town drunk at any point. I don't understand the need to kind of bring this thing up. That he would periodically be seen in a bar or a tavern having a beer or two. Gee whiz, I can't think of many people I know who haven't been in a tavern and had a beer or two once in a while. So.
Precisely. Didn't this cause a bit of a media firestorm when it first came out? And was
Absolutely.
Zamora interviewed by the national media?
Oh, absolutely. There were any number of reports in the newspapers that he had done attempting it. He was very reluctant to talk after a few days of this because he could see some of the way he was being treated by the media, and other police officers wouldn't have anything to do with the media because of that. Walter Cronkite reported it on his CBS Evening News program, and I remember seeing that as a kid. And of course that dates me, but you already said I'd been studying UFOs for 50 years and I was in Vietnam, so that pretty well ages me right there.
They've got you pegged now.
Absolutely. So it was, you can go to your local newspaper and probably find a story or two about Lonnie Zamora and what was going on in New Mexico after that sighting took place. So yes, it was a big story in 1964. And it kind of led to, and I say kind of because this was a period when there were lots of good UFO stories going on, and eventually led to congressional investigations, and eventually kind of inspired the Air Force to really nail down a university to study UFOs to end the Air Force investigation, which was the mission of it, was end the Air Force investigation, but it ended up in doing all that sort of thing. And so you have this period at the end of the 1960s where there was an awful lot of interest in UFOs from an awful lot of people in an awful lot of different arenas.
When did Zamora start to talk more openly about the symbol that he saw on this craft?
I'm not sure that he really talked openly about it. And I say that because of what Burns had said to him and that sort of thing. But what happened was, after the object disappeared, I mean, like the moment it was out of sight, he drew on a scrap of paper a symbol.
Right.
And then later on that night, he drew the symbol for Holder. He signed both of those with his name, Lonnie Zamora, so we know pretty much what he was drawing. That symbol appears in a number of different reports in the Project Blue Book files. And a fellow named Rick Baca, who was a 14-year-old boy in 1964, drew what the object looked like based on Zamora's descriptions of it. His father, Baca's father, was, I think, a paralegal in the city attorney's office in Socorro. And Zamora had gone to that, into the office to see if he was in any kind of trouble. He wanted to make sure he was in any kind of trouble, and he described exactly what he'd seen. And Baca Sr. described that to Baca Jr., and he made an illustration of it. And they took it back in to show Lonnie Zamora, and Zamora said, yeah, that's pretty much what I saw. But then, under his guidance, they drew the symbol on it as well. And that a picture like that, that picture actually appears in the April 1964 version of the April Bulletin, and I think you can find those online now. So you get to 1964 April Bulletin, and you'll see Baca's illustration with the symbol on it.
Kevin, I got to jump in here. We're
That's
we're
good.
going to step away for a moment. You get yourself a glass of water. You sounded great. Not to worry. We'll come back more on Encounter in the Desert. Kevin Randle, a giant in ufology, on this program. Don't you dare go away. Stay with us.
Poking holes in the darkness. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To see the light, call Richard now at 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
It's the enhancing
should you? Because they've got
Different views make great conversation. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio. To speak with Richard live, call 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
Welcome back. Kevin Randle is with us. Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Sorocco, New Mexico, 1964. Police officer Lonnie Zamaro, eyewitness to an incredible event. And I want to go back to the symbol, and you described or you explained where we can see it, but how would you describe it? And does it bear any resemblance, for example, to the symbols that a young Jesse Marcel Jr. Reported seeing on that what appeared to be sort of an I-beam back in 1947?
Quick answer, no. There's no resemblance to the symbols that Jesse Marcel saw. And nothing that his father saw either. It's I've always kind of described it. It's an arc with a V underneath it, with a line straight down from the apex of the V, and then a horizontal line across the bottom, sort of a arrowhead type thing with an arc over it. I always called it the umbrella symbol just because it was a simple way to describe it. The controversy came out about that because, according to some of the newspaper reports, the symbol is reported as an inverted V with 3 lines through it. That's the symbol that supposedly they made up to kind of weed out the copycats. And so you get both symbols being reported, although the newspapers talk about the inverted V, and it's not until a couple of weeks later you begin to see the proper symbol involved in that. Ray Stanford, interestingly, in his first report said that if you saw the umbrella symbol, that was the real symbol, and the inverted V with the 3 lines through it was the fake symbol. But when you get to his book, some 10 years later, he's got it reversed. Now it's the inverted V is the real symbol, and the umbrella symbol is not the real one. If you look at the documentation, Zamora drew the symbol twice, signed both of them. It's the umbrella symbol. I mean, that to me is the epitome of evidence there. The guy signed the symbols, and there was no reason for him to fake it in the files because they didn't expect anybody to see them.
Right.
You know, these were the Air Force files. There's a number of other reports in the files, the Blue Book files, and it's the umbrella symbol almost universally throughout it. The lone exception is a letter written, I think it's September 7th, 1964, by Jelen Hynek, and he's got an inverted V, and he's got a line above the apex of the V and 2 lines between the legs of the V. And I think it's just Hynek was confused by the discussions from the newspapers and all of that. There's another document that I have where I think Hynek was dictating his impressions or what he'd seen to Jenny Zeidman. And he makes a mention of the inverted V with the 3 lines through it from the newspapers, but he's also got the umbrella symbol in there as the real symbol. And I think he just got confused later on about what the symbol really looked like. So I think it's pretty well established. And I know Ben Moss and Tony Angiola and Ray Stanford don't agree with me on this, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that the symbol he actually saw is the umbrella's symbol. There's almost nothing in the logos for American corporations that resemble it. I mean, precisely. There's an international paper, I think, has got something that looks sort of like it, but I say sort of. It's not an exact match, so it's very confusing in that respect as well.
Has any other similar symbol ever shown up in either Blue Book or elsewhere?
I have not found anything. I know that at one point, Bud Hopkins was collecting symbols that had been seen by his abductees, and Carol Rainey, who was his ex-wife and was doing some work with it, had asked me some stuff about that at one point. So I went back and tried to find as many examples of symbology as I could that had been mentioned throughout the history of UFOs, including the papers found by a guy named Reeves, and I can't remember his. I keep wanting to say George Reeves, and that's not right.
That's Superman.
That's Superman.
Who knows?
The guy from Brooksville, Florida. His last name is Reeves, and he's not Steve Reeves either, who is Hercules, by the way. But he had a bunch of symbols on his paper that the Air Force had. There's other symbols. The Kecksburg craft had symbols around the bottom, that sort of thing. But I haven't ever found anything that matched that. So, you know, that's kind of where we are on that. So, and I think the skeptics have made a good point. You know, we don't have a lot of UFO sightings where there's symbols painted on the side. I mean, we look at an airplane and there's all kinds of crap painted on the sides of airplanes.
Right. It's not like we have an Audubon field guide.
Yeah.
Hold on, Kevin. This was a short segment. We'll come back and discuss further. Encounter in the Desert. Kevin Randle, my guest. Stay with us.
Question everything. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett on Zoomer Radio. Shaking the world and seeing what falls. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Before I get back to my conversation with Kevin Randle, author of Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Sorocco, let's check in with story producer Albert Vinzel. What's coming up next week on the program, Albert?
We have Jeff Worster from the Center for Deep Political Research, and he's an expert on JFK. JFK versus the deep state. Trump should be listening to this one.
All right. And who do we have in the second hour?
Our regular pundit on the paranormal, Rosemary Ellen Guiley.
Ah, yes, Rosemary. And we're going to talk about angels for the full hour. All the various orders of angels, Rosemary Ellen Guiley and Jeff Worster. All right. Kevin, it's no secret that Project Blue Book was kind of a dog and pony show to convince people that the Air Force was sort of taking these UFO sightings seriously, but they weren't. Although J. Allen Hynek, started off as a bit of a debunker, but kind of turned around. What role did Socorro and that sighting serve in terms of his conversion? And what did he say later in life about the Socorro episode?
Later in life, he became an advocate for the extraterrestrial explanation for Socorro. I think that about the time he got to Socorro, he was beginning to worry about the information and the evidence that he was seeing. As you say, he started out as a debunker, or a scientist who didn't think there was anything to this. And he began to see that there was much more to the UFO phenomenon that might be of scientific value. Not necessarily because it was extraterrestrial or alien in nature, but there was things to be learned. And I think that was one of the things we all need to look at as well, that even if it's not alien visitation, there's something going on, whether it's some kind of psychological phenomenon that we don't fully understand, or it's some kind of natural phenomenon we don't fully understand. But there are things that we could learn about humanity just by studying the reaction to UFO sightings and the belief in UFOs and that sort of thing, which is not to say that it may not be extraterrestrial in nature, but certainly we haven't been able to get our hands on the precise evidence. And I think that, that all comes down to what people will accept for evidence. Some people have a much lower threshold than others. I'd like to see multiple chains of evidence, and that includes the testimony. Testimony is a valuable resource when you're looking at these sorts of things, but something with physical evidence. And here at Socorro, we have that sort of physical evidence. And I think when Hynek looked at that sort of thing, and later on as he looked at some other cases that were bubbling to the surface at the time, including the sightings that took place in Michigan a couple of years later and that sort of thing. He began to see that there was much more to the UFO phenomenon than he had originally thought, and it wasn't just the purview of a bunch of drunks or crazy people or people having hallucinations, but there was something more important there, and it looked to him as if it was something physical in nature.
I asked you earlier about why Socorro was overshadowed by Roswell, and as you point out, an argument, a very strong argument could be made, I think, that Socorro is a far more documented case than is Roswell. And you talk about the physical evidence. Let's talk about the landing traces, and I'd be very keen to know what happened to that physical evidence.
One of the first things that they did, and I think it was Holder, he had a bunch of MPs come up from White Sands, and they cordoned off the area, so to speak, and they put rocks around the landing traces, the landing gear imprints, and those were photographed. So I mean, in the book, there's photographs that are from the Air Force files of those landing traces, and they're very clear to be seen. And they were pressed into the ground as opposed to excavated, which means something heavy sat there. There was also a couple of circular impressions in the ground, which would have been behind the object when it sat there. And the impression is that was like a ladder that came out of a hatch, and it was adjusted a couple of times. So you've got a number of circular footprints there, and then there were some light footprints as well that suggested that somebody had crawled up into the craft when it took off. You've got the bush that was partially burned, and they took samples from that, but they found no evidence of any petrochemicals or accelerants on there, which would have suggested, how the bush was set on fire. They found no evidence of that, so it was subjected to a heat source that didn't leave any kind of residue behind. They checked for radiation and didn't find anything like that. They took soil samples, and I was kind of curious because in the file it said that Holder had taken a bunch of samples that night. And I was wondering what happened to them. And as I was doing research for the book, that was one of the questions I had: what happened to Holder's soil samples? And I came across a report that said once Hynek got there, he gave all that material to Hynek. So Hynek had the soil samples, and they checked that. Stanford had soil samples that he took that were checked that really didn't reveal anything. Stanford also said that Zamora pointed out a rock to him that had some metal scrapings on it.
Right.
And nobody else seemed interested in it. So while they
seemed interested.
Yeah, they just sort of ignored that, and they went off to do this radio interview, and Stanford went with him. He said the minute the radio interview was over, he rushed back to the scene, found the rock, photographed it on its where it was, so he could put it back, and then he collected it and took it back to his home in Phoenix. Then he did a dumb thing, which was he was showing it to his neighbor outside, and he knocked off some of the bigger pieces of the metallic debris that was left behind. And he said they spent a lot of time going over the area with a magnifying glass and trying to find it, but they couldn't. But there were still some small samples left behind. Eventually, they went to Washington, D.C. with those, and Dick Hall arranged for them to be examined at the Goddard Center in Virginia, right close by. But then there becomes some controversy because, according to the official report, there was nothing extraordinary about these metallic samples, and they were almost all gone. I think Ray still has the rock, and from what he said, there's still some little samples on it, and they might be able to analyze it given today's technology, something they couldn't have done 20 years ago. But the official report, and that appears in the NICAP newspaper, was that there wasn't really anything extraordinary about the metal. I've always been of the opinion, the one thing that's always frightened me is we get a real piece of a flying saucer. I mean, real piece of a flying saucer, take it in to have it analyzed, and they say, yeah, it's aluminum. There's nothing to distinguish it from terrestrially based metals. But according to Ray, he was told by the scientist who did the investigation, and this is all kind of covered in the book, that it was something extraordinary. And then later on, when the official report came out, they said, no, it wasn't. And the scientist suddenly wouldn't take his phone calls and was transferred somewhere else. So there's a little bit of controversy about that. And Ray Stanford and Dick Hall kind of fought this thing out in the pages of the MUFON Journal, I think in the 1970s when Ray had published his book. So, that stuff can be found. And I made copious footnotes throughout the book, and so that everybody who wanted to follow up on where the information came from would be able to do so by reading all of that sort of thing and saying, well, it's the MUFON Journal number, whatever it is,
right,
and the date and the page number, so you could follow up on it pretty easily.
One of the other things that you point out in the book, and that is the number of other cases. This is what we don't hear about, are the number of cases involving sightings of what appear to be alien beings. Often they're dismissed as, well, this person had some psychological disorder and so forth. But you really bring this to the fore, that there were a number of celebrated cases, whether we're talking about, was it Flatwoods, West Virginia, and Kelly Hopkins, Kentucky, that case back in, was it the early 1950s? But there are others.
One of the things that had been sort of a myth in the Project Blue Book is there's only one case involving alien creatures or sightings of beings around the craft that was labeled unidentified, was the Zamora sighting. But there are actually two others that I was able to find. There might be more, and I haven't found them, but there was two others where it's not written off as a psychological problem of the person. And you look at Kelly Hopkinsville, which was the little creatures that were kind of assaulting the farmhouse, and the people inside panicked and were firing at the creatures and knocking them down, and they'd get up and run off and that sort of thing. But the Air Force, you go over to the Air Force file, and it's an important contrast. Here's Socorro, and it's treated seriously from the very beginning. I think it's because there were more than just the Air Force people involved. But you get to Kelly Hopkinsville, which happened in, I think, 1955, so it's 9 years earlier. The attitude was, well, nobody reported to the Air Force, so it doesn't count. We've got information only. But there is Air Force report. I mean, there was people who reported it to the Air Force. There was an officer on his annual tour, which means he was a reservist, and he was in the area, and he heard it on the radio, and so he made an investigation, reported the stuff to the Air Force. So there was an official investigation, but the Air Force claimed no, and that was the kind of thing they did. They stayed away from those sightings, and they made it look like you were hallucinating if you saw anything like this. Kelly Hopkinsville, they wrote it off and said, well, it was probably a monkey that escaped from a circus. Well, you are shooting at a monkey with a shotgun, and you've obviously hit it. There's going to be dead monkey. There's going to be evidence left behind, and there was no circus in town for them to see it. They also said, well, they had been to a Holy Roller meeting that night, a revival type thing, and they were all hopped up from that excitement. And so they hallucinated the whole thing, but that wasn't true either. So what you see is, in one respect, the Air Force, the military, the government, kind of ignoring these sightings or making light of them as best they can to keep the people from being interested in, kind of putting down the curtain of ridicule. And you look at Socorro and you contrast that, how it was taken seriously by practically everybody, although the investigation was pretty ham-handed and lacking, but they treated it seriously. And Hector Quintanilla, who was the chief of Project Blue Book at the time, in his memoirs said this is one case he wanted to explain. He had documentation that allowed him to look at top secret projects, and he went to Alamogordo, Holloman Air Force Base. He went to White Sands and to find out what they were doing at the time, see if it was some kind of black project. And I think that's what Zamora kind of thought it was, a black project. I know Sam Chevis thought it was a black project, and they would get in trouble for talking about it. But Quintanilla could find nothing like that would explain the sightings. And if he could have found it, it would have been in the Project Blue Book files at some point. But in his memoirs, written many, many years later, he said he couldn't find anything, and he was convinced that the answer was in Lonnie Zamora's head, meaning that there was something that Lonnie Zamora may have seen, or something that influenced him that would answer what he had seen in that arroyo, but he couldn't get to it. So he had to write it off as unidentified, which he did, which you have to applaud him for that. But he also said that he knew that the UFO hobbyist would have a field day when he concluded that it was an unidentified case.
You've been to Socorro. I mean, your colleague Don Schmidt has interviewed a lot of the children of witnesses and so forth. He's in a race against the Undertaker, obviously, to get to the truth. I'm guessing the same thing in Socorro. Are there still stories to be unearthed in Socorro relating to this incident, do you think?
Well,
Kevin?
where we are now is simply that the primary people are gone. And so we're left with the secondhand witnesses. And I'm just not a fan of that kind of information, because it can get so badly garbled in the translation. I know I talked to a fellow in Socorro named Paul Harden, and he said in the months before Lonnie died that he and Lonnie had gone out and toured the area, talked about the case a little bit, so he got a better idea of what Lonnie had to say. And I asked him, well, what did Lonnie say? He said, well, it was between me and Lonnie. I really don't want to talk about it. Zamora's wife and his daughter are still around, and I think James Fox, who's doing a UFO project, has talked to them about it and seen some of the material that Lonnie had. And what Fox had told me was that Lonnie had a big box full of letters, documents that he'd received from people who had similar sightings and wanted to tell him what he'd seen. And also that there were some pictures, but when they went through the boxes, they couldn't find the pictures. Which,
oh dear.
Yeah, well, that's ufology for you. Well,
there you are, Kevin.
Here we have us lead to the pictures. Oh, sorry, they're gone. Too bad.
Oh dear, Kevin. Listen, we're out of time. This has been phenomenal. I hope you'll join me again.
I would be delighted, but I didn't know you were coming apart. I couldn't resist that.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Socorro, Kevin Randle. My thanks to young Sebastian Hearn, Albert Vinzel, and young Ryan White. Back next week, Rosemary Ellen Guiley and Jeff Worster, the Deep State versus JFK. Hope you'll be along for the ride. Good night.